Good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Haber, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Lucille Spear Memorial Lecture, which is a culmination of the 2005-2006 President's Lecture Series. And it's also my pleasure to begin by wishing everybody a happy May Day. In case you don't know what May Day is, I'm going to just spend a little time telling you what May Day is and link it to the study of international relations. May Day is International Workers' Day. Now, different people around the world tell different versions of the story. For me, it begins with a commemoration of the Haymarket Riot of 1886 in Chicago, and a celebration of the social and economic achievements of the international labor movement. The 1st of May date is used because in 1884, the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions demanded an 8-hour workday in the United States to come in effect as of May 1st, 1886. This resulted in a general strike and the riot in Chicago of 1886, but eventually also in the official sanction of the 8-hour workday. For well over 100 years, May Day in many parts of the world has been and continues to be an occasion for workers and those who claim to represent them to celebrate who they are and the work they do, to value the contribution of the working class to the collective good. It has been and continues to be an opportunity to demonstrate and protest what is perceived to be affronts against the working class. This is certainly the case in much of Latin America. Historically, there have been a number of attempts around the world to permanently co-opt or subvert May Day's radical labor origins. Perhaps the most notable among the attempts is that in the United States, where instead of May Day, a special Labor Day is celebrated on the first Monday in September. As Latin Americans come to the United States to live and work, as their numbers grow, so does their influence. There was today a large number of May Day marches and demonstrations in many parts of the United States. I even hear there was something in Missoula. A day without immigrants, the organizers christened it, in which immigrants boycotted work, school, and shopping, and perhaps found their way out into the streets to let their voices be heard. This is in keeping with this May Day tradition. It just might be that May Day, in its original intent, will be reborn in the United States. For most of us in this room, I presume that to consider May Day in a deep way requires of us to think outside our daily lives. Most of us in this room are not of the working class, or, if we are in school to see what we can do to reach the American dream of finding our way into the middle class or beyond. May Day, for most of us, I presume, asks that we consider the concerns of people other than ourselves. In my view, thinking about international relations and U.S. foreign policy requires something similar. What is going on outside of our borders, way beyond most of our daily lives? And how is the United States acting out there beyond our borders? In particular, we ask, what is the United States government doing in our name? Is it keeping us safe? Is it helping us to prosper? What values and interests is it promoting? How is our reputation doing? And if we bring the May Day sensibility into the equation, we might also ask, How is what we do influencing the lives of others? Our speaker, Professor Andrew Bacevich, has been concerning himself with these kinds of questions for a very long time. Professor Bacevich graduated from West Point in 1969 and served in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War from the summer of 1970 to the summer of 1971. Afterwards, he held posts in Germany, the United States, and the Persian Gulf, up to his retirement from the service with the rank of lieutenant colonel in the early 1990s. His PhD is in the field of diplomatic history from Princeton University. Professor Bacevich has held a series of fellowships and teaching positions at some of America's finest institutions. He currently teaches at Boston University in the Department of International Relations, a department, by the way, that Professor Bacevich noted earlier today has 900 majors. His bibliography runs 14 pages long. By my count, he has authored 10 books and monographs, 38 major essays, 160 short articles and opinion pieces. His most recent book, The New American Militarism, he's agreed to sign copies after his talk out in the foyer. In his spare time, he also has a penchant for book reviews, having published 89 of them since 1981. We have with us tonight a man who clearly reads, thinks, writes, and debates deeply about international relations and the role of the United States in the world. What I find most compelling about Professor Bacevich's resume is the diversity of locations in which he publishes. I don't know if there is anybody else around today who has published in the New Left Review, the Journal of Military History, Commentary, and The Nation, to give you just a slice of the diversity of his publication locations. What this signifies to me is an independent mind, comfortable in many arenas and listened to by a wide variety of audiences. Independent thinking public intellectuals make significant contributions to the quality of democracy. In fact, I don't think it would be overstating the case to say that a truly vibrant democracy cannot do without them. Please join me in welcoming Professor Andrew J. Bacevich.
That was an incredibly generous introduction, which I did not deserve. I thank you very much for coming this evening to this presentation. I'm dazzled by the turnout. I have never visited Missoula or the university before, and I'm not just blowing smoke at you. This is a special place, and you're very, very, very fortunate, I think, to be here. It's a great honor for me to be invited to give the Lucille Spear Memorial Lecture, and I should be thanking about 15 different people for that, but let me just single out in particular Professor Richard Drake, who invited me and made all this happen. I usually give talks, in Unitarian churches where there's about 6 people and average age is about 78, so I'm a little nervous this evening. So the talk is called "How Durable is the American Empire?" Don't get excited about empire, because I'm going to try to make the case to you why you might want to at least consider the proposition that we have become a sort of empire. two preliminary points. The first is I haven't given this talk before, so it's a work in progress. And I have all these typed sheets and yellow handwritten sheets. So if I get lost, just give me about 3 seconds to find out where I am. And the second preliminary point is, and I need to say this because we just had a wonderful but very stimulating dinner at the President's house, I am going to say some things about the Iraq War. So right now, if you have strong feelings about the Iraq War, I want you to take a deep breath. Okay, so how durable is the American empire? Let me tell you my beat. My beat is contemporary U.S. foreign policy. And when I left the Army in 1992, virtually as soon as I left the Army, and trying to pay attention to the evolution of U.S. foreign policy after the Cold War, I began to be troubled by things that I saw and not through any conscious plan, just kind of drifted into this being my particular area of interest. When I was a kid, I was born in 1947, really in a sense the birth year of the Cold War itself. 1947, the year of Kennan's famous Mr. X article in Foreign Affairs, the year of the enunciation of the Truman Doctrine, the year of the enunciation of the Marshall Plan. So I grew up understanding the Cold War as the dominant story of my time, of our time. And I'm not exactly sure how or why, but I came to the view that the Cold War really constituted a protracted national emergency. It was going to go on for a long time. Nobody really knew when it was going to end or how it was going to end, but somehow or other I imagined that there was a common understanding that somewhere out there the Cold War would end, and that when it ended, the United States would go back to becoming a normal nation again. I'm absolutely, positively for sure, if somebody had said to me, "What's a normal nation?" I wouldn't have been able to give a very cogent answer, but I had this firm sense that we were engaged in an emergency that was causing us to have departed from the norm. And so there was going to be a change when that distant day came that the Cold War ended. Well, the Cold War did end. And to me, the most striking thing was the extent to which nothing changed. That the sort of the basic parameters that defined American policy didn't change all that much, and indeed, U.S. foreign policy in the aftermath of the Cold War has been defined more than anything else by its continuities with all that had transpired during this period of what I thought was a national emergency. And this was the issue that grabbed my attention. Why no change? What were the underpinnings of American policy that caused us to continue to proceed down the same course, despite the fact that the adversary that had presumably, whose existence had caused us to behave the way we behaved in the late 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s had now departed. Nothing had changed, I thought. What's going on here? Well, in retrospect, I have to say, from the perspective of the year 2006, my expectations of what ought to have happened after the fall of the Berlin Wall were naive. It's much clearer to me today, in the year 2006, this powerful sense of providential mission, which is somehow hardwired into us as Americans, and that accounts for our oversized ambitions. That's never going to go away. And I think I was naive for a second reason as well, and that is that I failed to appreciate at the time the Cold War was ending the extent to which our exertions during the 20th century as a nation, and in particular our exertions from World War II forward, had really enmeshed us in a nest of complications from which we could extricate ourselves only with the greatest difficulty. So my remarks tonight are intended to provide some sort of a preliminary set of reflections on where the events of the past 15 years or so, the events of the post-Cold War era, where they've brought us, and quite frankly, how they've brought us to a circumstance that I at least find deeply troubling. So what I'm going to try to do is to lay out where this empire, my word, not necessarily yours, comes from, and then to try to tell you what would be the measures to determine the durability of this project. And I'd like to begin by laying out what I think are 4 large truths that during the course of the 1990s very much defined the conventional political wisdom. Now, these are not necessarily ideas that you sitting there in your chair are going to say, well, yeah, that's exactly what I believed, although I suspect that some of you will say this. But there are 4 truths that I think gripped political Washington. First of those truths was the conviction that the end of the Cold War had settled once and for all the ideological struggles thought to have defined the 20th century. And indeed, it was thought that ideological struggles had defined, had determined the meaning of the 20th century. And in that sense, 1989 presumably marked a fundamental turning point in history. The second of these 4 truths that defined the conventional wisdom of the 1990s was that verdict rendered in 1989, when the Berlin Wall falls, the Soviet Empire disintegrates, and communism is discredited, that verdict affirmed the validity and the universal applicability of liberal democratic capitalism. That is to say, that the verdict of 1989 was thought to have affirmed the validity and the universal applicability of the principles and norms defining the American way of life. The third truth defining the conventional political wisdom in the 1990s was that verdict had also vindicated the efforts of the United States as the preeminent exemplar of liberal democratic capitalism, and in so doing affirmed America's claim to being the nation that defined what President Clinton had used to refer to as the right side of history. That what we were somehow signified the direction, the purpose of history itself. And the fourth of these truths, and we'll get back to this one, the fourth of these truths was that the exertions undertaken by the United States, both in World War I and the Korean and the Cold War, had left the United States in a position of paramount strength. Economic strength, cultural strength, and especially military strength without precedent in history. You know, France came out on the winning side of World War I, and the consequence of that was France went into decline. Granted, there are some in France who haven't recognized that yet. Great Britain comes out in the winning side in World War II, and the British Empire vanishes. But our conclusion, our reading of 1989 was different. That we had come out on the winning side of the Cold War. And the consequence of that was, we believed, that we were more powerful than ever before. More powerful than any nation in the history of the world. That's what our politicians used to pontificate about back in the 1990s. Now, the immediate impact of these four great truths was to give rise to heightened expectations, a new confidence as the United States faced the future. Because what these truths together pointed to was the conclusion that history was destined to continue along its prescribed course. As the world's sole superpower, as the indispensable nation, great phrase of Madeleine Albright, the United States would preside over this predetermined evolution of history, nudging it along, disciplining those slow to get with the program, and thereby ensuring that the post-Cold War order suited our interests, thereby perpetuating our standing on top of the pyramid. That is to say, the verdict of the Cold War suggested that what we like to call the American century would continue in perpetuity. This was the expectation that the end of the Cold War gave rise to. Now, what do we call America's role in this post-Cold War order? Well, the folks in Washington, official people, preferred to describe America's role after 1989 as that of exercising global leadership, sort of an anodyne term. Even in the 1990s, however, there were some enthusiasts for leadership that found the term itself inadequate. These people were particularly found in the camp of those that we now call neoconservatives. The neoconservatives wanted to describe America's proper role as hegemony, global hegemony, benign hegemony, they insisted. But they liked that word hegemony, I think, because hegemony implies prerogatives that somehow look well beyond leadership. Leadership's congenial. Hegemony has teeth. By the late 1990s, at the earliest, there were other observers of U.S. foreign policy after the Cold War, and I myself happened to be in this camp. There were other observers less keen on what they saw in U.S. policy who began to refer to it as a variant of imperialism. And indeed, by the late 1990s, articles and books on the American empire had become sort of a cottage industry. These charges of an American empire were not really all that new. They had been heard before, most recently in the 1960s, during the time of the Vietnam War. But in those days, charges of American empire had almost always come from the far left. Interestingly, the new critics of the American empire, as they called it, were found on both the left and the right. Not the mainstream left and right, in a sense, the dissident left and the dissident right. This critique of an American empire did not argue that the American empire was like the old British Empire, that it was a colonial enterprise aimed at direct rule over subject peoples. Rather, this notion of a new empire described it as an informal empire in which the United States was attempting to rely on its enormous power to maintain stability and to prescribe and enforce certain norms of behavior that were conducive to American interests, and at least in some places at some of the time reflected American values. Bill Clinton in the 1990s was in many respects the most eloquent spokesman for, advocate of, promoter of this informal American empire. Although Clinton tended to, in his foreign policy rhetoric, tout the ostensible benefits of globalization as kind of the defining aspect of the emerging international order, Clinton was very quick to recognize that globalization was never going to work absent stability in the world. And facts very quickly confronted President Bill Clinton with the reality that there were enormous sources of instability in the world, despite the end of, or in some respects, because of the end of the Cold War. Instability in the Balkans, instability in the Caribbean, instability in the Horn of Africa, instability in the Persian Gulf. And the consequence of that was Bill Clinton inaugurated a new willingness to actually put American power, especially American military power, to work to try to address these causes of instability and to create the stability that the new American empire needed to flourish. Bill Clinton made military intervention routine. And I harp on that a little bit because I think that our discussion, our public discussion of U.S. foreign policy, especially since 9/11, has come to be so fixated in what would be the perceived errors or crimes of the Bush administration, as we have come to overlook the extent of continuities between Bill Clinton, the liberal Democrat, and George W. Bush, the ostensibly conservative Republican. Because I think the continuities are enormously powerful and informative. So we got lots of military interventionism with Bill Clinton. If you think back to the year 2000 and the presidential campaign of that year, you will recall that Governor George W. Bush expressed great skepticism about many aspects of Bill Clinton's foreign policy, but notably great skepticism about Clinton's willingness to be deploying U.S. troops far and wide for a wide range of purposes, not least among them nation building, that George W. Bush professed to disparage. But 9/11 changed all that, as far as George W. Bush was concerned. 9/11 produces an expansion of U.S. aims, so much so that the candidate who expressed great skepticism about our capacity to change societies publicly vowed to make an end to evil in the world. Perhaps somewhat more narrowly, but still rather boldly, President Bush, after 9/11, committed the United States to an effort to bring liberal democracy to the entire broader Middle East, a region generally defined as extending from Morocco in the west to the southern Philippines in the east. That effort to transform the greater Middle East gave rise to the Bush Doctrine of preventive war. The Bush Doctrine of preventive war gave rise to the invasion of Iraq. And the invasion of Iraq has given rise, of course, to an ever louder chorus of critics who think that the American empire is going off the rails. So let me focus on now the core question. What are the prospects of this imperial enterprise in which we find ourselves here in the spring of 2006? How durable is this new American empire likely to be? Well, it seems to me that any empire, or maybe particularly our empire, any empire is going to need four things in particular. First of all, it's going to need resources. It's going to need resources that are adequate to the purposes of the empire. You've got to have means that are appropriate to your ends. Secondly, at least in this empire, if it's a democratic empire, the empire is going to need sufficient public will, which is something even more than public support, to see the enterprise through. And third, any sort of a durable empire is going to require some sort of coherent strategy, some sort of general understanding of what resources are going to be committed to what sort of purposes. And fourth, an empire is going to need an emperor. It's going to need to have somebody in charge, somebody who has the authority and somebody who has the vision to lead and do what's in the imperial interest. From my own perspective, by the year 2006, events, especially events related to the Iraq War, ought to raise doubts in all our minds about whether or not the United States today possesses any of these in sufficient quantity to sustain the empire. Let me go down them one at a time. Number one was resources, and I'll talk about military resources, I'll talk about economic resources, I'll talk about strategic resources. Military resources. You know and I know that we have the greatest military forces in the globe. You probably know that the United States spends more on defense today than the rest of the world put together. But let's face the facts. The world's most powerful military has been checked in Iraq by a force of perhaps 10 to 20,000 insurgents who are armed with homemade bombs, AK-47s, and rocket-propelled grenades that were probably designed in the immediate aftermath of World War II. We can't win this war militarily. I mean, if winning militarily, if victory means impose your will on the enemy, we don't have the capability to win militarily in Iraq. Don't believe me, that's what the generals say. That's precisely why we are making this urgent effort to try to raise sufficient Iraqi political and military power to turn the war over to the Iraqis. Furthermore, here now at the beginning of the fourth year of this war, we need to understand that those services which are most directly engaged in this war are now just about tapped out. I mean, if you want to carry your battle group, we got plenty of them to spare. If you need a B-2 bomber, we got some. They're not busy. But if you need a soldier or you need a Marine, he's either in Iraq, on the way to Iraq, or just came back from Iraq. We're just about tapped out when it comes to fighting troops. And this is a remarkable thing. It's a remarkable thing because of the size of our population that serves in uniform today. Last year, in 2005, the United States Army experienced its worst recruiting year in a quarter of a century. Population of this country is now over 290 million. The recruiting goal of the U.S. Army in 2005 was 80,000. They had to find 80,000 capable recruits out of a population of 290 million. And despite lots of money spent on advertising, despite the offer of generous bonuses, despite the lowering of enlistment standards, despite the memory of 9/11, recruiters still came up short 7,000 out of 80,000. There's been other more recent evidence of problems in the ranks. You've been reading about it in the newspapers, and that's the so-called revolt of the generals, in which recently retired Army and Marine Corps generals, to include generals who had senior troop command positions in Iraq, have now begun to publicly demand the firing of Secretary Rumsfeld. Hardly an indication of a disciplined, cohesive force responsive to civilian control. What are the implications of this for the durability of the empire? Well, to the extent that the imperial project assumes readily available military resources, it seems to me the implications are self-evident. This is a huge problem. Economic resources. We are a country blessed with phenomenal abundance. And yet it needs to be said, or at least it needs to be speculated, that there are contradictions just beneath the surface that might call our prosperity into question. U.S. government indebtedness currently is above $8.3 trillion. U.S. government indebtedness has increased during the Bush era by $1.1 trillion. That is to say, we've got a Republican president, and the Republicans in control of both houses of Congress. When I was a kid, if the Republicans stood for one thing, it was balance the budget, keep spending down. And they've increased the debt of the country by $1.1 trillion. Last year, the federal deficit came in at a whopping $427 billion, despite all the talk about the necessity to control costs. Last year, U.S. trade relations, our trade deficit with the rest of the world, topped $800 billion, which is over 7% of our nation's GDP. If Argentina had a trade imbalance that constituted even 5% of its GDP, Argentina would be viewed as an economic basket case. How do we balance the books? We balance the books by borrowing. From whom do we borrow? We borrow from foreign countries. Last year, for example, our debt to the People's Republic of China increased by $200 billion. I'm not an economist, But it really seems to me that in a very fundamental sense, our economic house is not in order. And that, too, ought to have some implications for the durability of the American empire. The last of the three resource issues I wanted to talk to you about has to do with strategic resources. Strategic resources really here is just a code word for oil. President has said, we are a country addicted to oil. President is correct. It's oil we don't have. U.S. oil fields passed their peak in productivity 3.5 decades ago. The U.S. today possesses something on the order of about 3% of the world's known oil reserves. Even as we consume, I think it's 1 out of every 4 barrels of oil pumped out of the ground every day. Currently, the consumption of oil, our consumption of oil, is running to the tune of 7 billion barrels a year. Of those 7 billion barrels a year, 4 come from abroad. I don't know, maybe you'll disagree with me, but it seems to me that the circumstance I just described can only get worse. What are the strategic implications for this addiction to oil when it's foreign oil? Again, it seems to me it's fairly self-evident if we just sort of look at the facts that are in front of us, and that is that energy dependence constrains our freedom of action. Energy dependence makes us do things that we think are necessary to prop up our prosperity in the near term, even if in the longer term they are contrary to our interests. And I would cite U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia as an illustration of that. So item number 2 in this effort to, this question of what do you need to prop up your empire, item number 2 had to do with public will and public support. In a sense, of course, there is public support. In the sense that we all support the troops. But when President Bush says, as he says in the 2006 version of the National Security Strategy, when the president says that we are, quote, a nation at war, you know and I know that we're not. That's not the case. In fact, public willingness to sacrifice is negligible. There was almost zero support for the notion of actually raising the revenue necessary to pay for this war in which we are engaged. So we simply borrow all that much more, pass it off to future generations. And there's certainly, at least on my campus, there's zero support for any effective government action to remedy the shortfall in recruiting. In other words, restore conscription. So public support for the global war on terror, public support for the Iraq War, public support for the American empire tends to be vocal rather than substantive. And that, too, doesn't spell well for the durability of the American empire. The third measure, I said we needed to have a coherent strategy. Well, what kind of strategy do we have? Let me talk to you what I think the strategic vision of the Bush administration has been and where it has brought us and where it is going and why it has not worked. After Afghanistan, meaning after we invaded Afghanistan, toppled the Taliban, and dispersed the Al-Qaeda, the Bush administration clearly focused its attention, riveted its attention on Iraq. What was going on? What's the idea? It was not about weapons of mass destruction. You'll remember when Mr. Wolfowitz famously said in a newspaper article that the reason that the administration argued weapons of mass destruction as the principal rationale for the invasion because that was the one thing that all the members of the bureaucracy could agree on. And I think he was speaking the truth. But the underlying strategic vision was not related to Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. The underlying strategic vision was this: invade Iraq to thrust the U.S. military into the heart of the broader Middle East as a clear and unmistakable demonstration of American will and American power. In doing that, acquire, they hoped, a new, not incidentally oil-rich ally, one that would preferably, in short order, embrace liberal values and therefore constitute an example for the rest of the region, and thereby permit the United States to remove its offending military presence from Saudi Arabia. Then, from this new base of operations, this military presence having been established at the heart of the broader Middle East, from this new base of operations, promote the political transformation of the entire region, thereby eliminating the conditions breeding violent Islamic radicalism in the first place, securing the long-term stability of the Middle East, and ensuring our continued access to Middle Eastern energy resources. In other words, what I've just said is that the Iraq War was not intended to be the decisive stroke. The Iraq War was envisioned as the catalyst, the trigger to a much larger proposition. If Afghanistan was step 2, step 1, Iraq was step 2, and there was going to be a 3, 4, and 5. Let me be clear, I'm not suggesting to you that then they were going to invade Syria, and then they were going to invade Saudi Arabia, and then they were going to invade Iran. Rather, their expectation was that by this demonstration of power, the United States would be in a position to effectively influence the entire region. Some of it might have involved the use of force, but much of it they thought would not involve the use of force. Now, I have to tell you that I myself think that the strategy was, from the very outset, implausible and unrealistic and far too grandiose. But what we're learning now, as the war continues to unfold, and as our knowledge of the first phases of the war becomes greater, what we're beginning to learn now is that elements within the Bush administration itself actually, not intentionally, but actually subverted this strategy. Let me explain two examples of that. When you think about it, the mission given to the military, if the object of the exercise is to transform the Middle East, then the mission given to the military as it enters Iraq is, in a very fundamental sense, a revolutionary mission. And yet the military that engaged in the Iraq War in its initial stages actually chose to interpret that mission in the narrowest possible terms. People like General Tommy Franks, the commander of Central Command at the time of the invasion, saw his mission as one of toppling Saddam Hussein, restoring a semblance of stability, and then going home. Franks's plan was that by September of 2003, there will be only 30,000 troops left in Iraq. Forget the fact that that never happened because of the insurgency. Had he been able to implement that, then the U.S. would not have been in a position to use Iraq as the base for this transformation. In other words, the U.S. military failed to posture itself properly for all of the steps that would follow a successful invasion. In an ironic sense, Secretary Rumsfeld also has subverted this strategy of transformation. And let me explain how he has done it. I just finished reading this book, Cobra 2, by Michael Gordon and Bernard Traynor. It's a good book. I recommend it to you. And Gordon and Traynor make clear that when Rumsfeld is conceiving of the war plan for Operation Iraqi Freedom, putting together the plan for how are we going to invade and take down Saddam, he views this operation primarily as a way of validating his plans to transform the American military. I don't want to get into a lot of technical stuff here, but there's been a big argument going on inside of the national security establishment for the last decade and a half. In simple terms, the argument is mostly people in uniform persuaded that there's something about war that never really changes all that much, and that therefore organizations, methods, weapon systems that have been evolved over the last 40, 50 years have continuing relevance. Count the opposite camp, mostly not entirely civilians, says that no, the information revolution is radically changing the nature of warfare. We don't need tanks. We don't need aircraft carriers. We don't need manned fighter bombers. We need stealth, precision weapons, unmanned aerial vehicles, forces that are leaner, faster, more agile, smarter. Rumsfeld's in that camp. Rumsfeld sees Operation Iraqi Freedom as the vehicle whereby he's going to show he's right. And in showing he's right, he's going to blow away the bureaucratic resistance that is getting in the way of following through on this vision. That is to say that by demonstrating the efficacy of shock and awe, remember that phrase? That he'll be able to radically transform the U.S. military. So he designs a war plan. Think here of the great arguments between Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and General Shinseki, right? So he designs a war plan with an eye towards making a swift march on Baghdad rather than thinking through the aftermath of that march. But if the strategy looks to an effort to transform the region, then what happens after the march on Baghdad is at least, if not more important, as what you do to get there. What's my bottom line on this point? My bottom line is, even if you think that a strategy intended to transform the Middle East in order to eliminate the sources of Islamic radicalism is a sound strategy, this administration has shot itself in the foot, making it almost impossible for such a strategy to work. What's the bottom line? Bottom line is in Iraq today, we really don't, and in the Middle East today, we really don't have a strategy. We're simply muddling along at enormous cost to us as a people, and that does not bode well for the durability of the American empire. My last point was the need for leadership. And I'm not going to sit here and throw stones at President Bush. I think actually our leadership problems are much broader than I think we appreciate. We are in the habit, we Americans are in the habit of describing the president as the most powerful man in the world. I wonder if he really is. I wonder how powerful the president actually is. It seems to me that there is a profound irony that the guy we think is so powerful actually has enormous limits on what he can do. The dysfunction of the U.S. government, in which Congress and the people defer to the president on all matters related to national security, is extraordinary. And yet, despite this deference, the president's actual ability to control events is very, very limited. I mean, put yourself in the president's shoes today with regard to Iraq. I mean, the most powerful man in the world could make the decision to invade the country. The most powerful man in the world could give the order to the American military, go forth and do this. But having given that order and having mired the United States in this mess, what can the most powerful man in the world do now? To tell you the truth, I think he can do precious little. We don't have an effective empire or emperor. In a sense, it seems to me President Bush made an enormous fundamental error in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. When he committed the nation to what he called the global war on terror, which he said at the outset was going to be a protracted war, he ought to have mobilized the nation for that war. But he chose not to do so. He told us to go to Disney World. He told us to enjoy the American way of life. He told us to start flying on airplanes again because the airlines were going bankrupt. And we listened, and we've done that. And now the truth is, he no longer has the capacity to mobilize us as a people to implement his grand vision. So my bottom line is that prospects for the durability of the American empire, or if you don't like the word empire, prospects for the durability of American global leadership are not all that promising. What should we do? And here's where I'll conclude. First of all, you know my true answer to what should we do is, if I knew, I would be the national security advisor. I'm not. But let me offer you 4 quick thoughts on what we ought to do. Number one, we need to sober up. We need to disenthrall ourselves as a people from the notion that the United States of America has the capacity either to understand the direction of history or to make it go where it's supposed to go. And we ought to throw stones at politicians who pontificate and make claims that they understand where history is headed. We need to become much more realistic in evaluating what is in fact the very real limits of our power. That was point number one. Point number two is, in my judgment, we need to liquidate our combat role in Iraq with all reasonable speed. Not cut and run, but to act expeditiously to turn over responsibility for this fiasco to the Iraqis to sort out themselves. I'm not sure I can make a strong moral case for that course of action. But as a practical matter, it seems to me to be essential. If only because at the end of the day, the war is theirs, either to win or to lose. We cannot win it for them. If we persist in trying, all we are going to do is to exhaust ourselves in the vain effort to try. So we need to get out. Item number 3 is, I think, and this is a broader issue, I think we need to reassess whether the global war on terror, the GWAT, according to the acronym, whether the GWAT is the proper organizing paradigm for thinking about how we should respond to the threat that we recognized on 9/11. If you like the GWAT, if you believe that, yes, a global war against terror, and we understand when the government says terror, that's a stand-in for Islamic radicalism. If you believe that a global war against Islamic radicalism makes sense, then it seems to me you need to be in favor of mobilizing the resources for a global war. Having 0.5% of the population in uniform isn't going to cut it. We need to, if you believe in the GWAT, we need to expand the armed forces significantly. We owe it to our grandchildren to increase our taxes so that we actually pay for the war that we're fighting. And we need to make substantial adjustments in our domestic priorities so that if we're going to fight this war, we're going to win it. If we don't have the stomach for those sacrifices, I myself believe that we do not, then we might want to consider an alternative approach, an alternative to response to 9/11 that is not a global war on Islamic radicalism. Here's a quick take on what an alternative approach might look like. Rather than thinking about terrorism as Islamic radicals, think about terrorists, or narrow your focus on those terrorists who in fact pose a threat to us. That's Al-Qaeda and other similar groups associated with Al-Qaeda. What are these people? These people are criminals. Al-Qaeda is in fact an international criminal conspiracy. What do we do when we have a problem with crime? We don't go to war. We call out the cops. What we need is to organize an unrelenting international police effort to root out and destroy this criminal conspiracy. When I say the word police, I don't mean the guys and gals in blue suits sitting in squad cars. I mean intelligence organizations, special operation forces on a global basis to locate them and destroy them. Having said that, Islamic radicalism is a problem. But we might want to recognize that Islamic radicalism is not something that simply emerged out of the blue on 9/11. It is, in fact, a phenomenon with extraordinarily complex historical roots, and it is a phenomenon to which we in the West helped give rise. The response to Islamic radicalism, it seems to me, is not to go to war, but to try to contain it, frustrate it, and generally work towards its pacification. In some respects, we ought to treat Islamic radicalism, or approach Islamic radicalism, the same way we approached the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Fourth and last point. Beyond all questions of near-term strategy, what to do about Iraq, broader strategy, whether we like the global war on terror, it seems to me that there is an urgent need to begin now to work on a project that will no doubt take several decades, and that is one that seeks to enhance our own freedom of action, so that whether or not we are the most powerful nation in the world, we might at least become, once again, masters of our own fate. And that has to do with this addiction to oil, which we must end. And I, for one, believe that the only way to end it is to be willing to undertake modifications to the American way of life. We have to change in order to wean ourselves from this addiction so that we can be once again in charge of our own destiny. I don't for a second, not for a second, would I pretend that that's going to be easy. I do think it is imperative. So with that, having talked longer than I intended, I'll stop, and I look forward to your comments and to your questions. Thank you very much.
So Professor Bacevich is fine to take questions. We've got about a half an hour. You'll notice there's 2 microphones here on either side. So if you want to ask a question, come on up to one of those mics. And I would just only ask you, if you're going to make a comment before your question, that you try to keep that brief so that more people will have a turn to ask the question.
Bacevich.
Yes, sir, you're up.
Thank you very much for your very forceful and cogent analysis of the situation. It's a rare thing for us to
Then you're going to say but. I know you're going to say but.
No.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
I don't know if maybe some of the folks could give me a but to say, but well, I will say that I appreciate the scope and the focus that you brought to this situation, but for some reason I did not get a sense that the economic underpinning of empire or of military or of the way the world works was in your purview. And it seems to me that there are differences in how we could approach these problems that depend to a large extent on what specific economic arrangements we have that provide the underpinnings for national policy. So I'd like to ask you whether you think that the role, especially during the globalization period, of the corporation, especially in the United States, plays such an overwhelming role now in the determination of policy, both domestic and foreign, that we should look there perhaps for some solutions to what we're facing today. Thank you.
Don't leave yet, because I want to make sure I understand. I think you said that in my presentation I didn't offer any prescription for economic policy. I was just, making wild charges about trade imbalances and in debt, but I didn't say how we were supposed to fix that. And then you went on to say, isn't it possible that the influence of large corporations is at the root of those sorts of problems? Is that what you asked, sir?
I think that's basic.
Okay. It is a very fair comment to say that I did not offer any economic prescriptions, and I'm reluctant to do so because I'm not competent to do so. I am, as somebody who doesn't fully understand economics, I don't understand how we can continue indefinitely to sort of run the operation ever deeper in the red and have it be sustainable. As somebody who doesn't fully understand economics, I am deeply troubled by the evidence that one of the effects of globalization, even in the developed world, is to increase the disparity between the very rich and everybody else. disturbed by what I think is pretty good data that shows that even the middle class, over the past, I couldn't give you the right number of years, but 25, 30 years, has in fact has not improved its economic standing. Incomes, in a sense, are flat among the middle class. I'm deeply uncomfortable with the extent to which we're hollowing out the manufacturing sector. I recognize that that's, in a sense, yesterday's economy. But I'm not comfortable with the extent to which those jobs get exported, and increasingly we are a service economy that measures the health of our economy based on consumer demand. I don't know if it affected you. I just noticed it last year. Did you discover Black Friday? Black Friday is the day after Thanksgiving. I didn't know this. And everybody gets excited about Black Friday because it's the biggest spending day of the year. And so you measure the economy based on the extent to which we all ran down to Walmart and Target and, emptied our purses, or I should say, handed over our credit cards. So all these things bother me, but I don't know enough exactly about economics to explain what the way out is. So you're right, it's a deficiency in my talk which I intend to correct. Sometimes you just admit you're wrong, that's all. That's what the president should do. I'm sorry.
Since no one else seems to be coming up to the microphone, I wonder if I'd be...
We'll see.
I'd like to start by saying thank you for your service to our country. My question is this. I believe that everything begins with someone's idea. And I think that our current dilemma is the result of an idea that quite possibly was generated not just from this side of the Atlantic Ocean, but perhaps with assistance from dissidents of the country of Iraq. And I'm wondering your take whether or not it is possible that not only did we as a country decide to invade, but it's possible that we may have been invited as well.
I mean, you're talking about Ahmed Chalabi?
Right.
Okay. Ahmed Chalabi is the head of, what's it called? The INC, Iraqi National Congress, which was one of the, somebody will know much more about this than I do, forgive me, an umbrella organization of Iraqi dissidents Chalabi himself, this is what I think. It's clear that Chalabi had significant credibility among certain circles in Washington during the 1990s and in the run-up to the war. And the circles equals the neoconservatives. It's also pretty apparent that he was viewed with enormous suspicion and disdain by others in official Washington, and my impression is that equals the CIA and the State Department chiefly. What was his role in the decision to invade and the thinking about how to invade? I think it was significant but not decisive. It was significant because he was making an argument about the ease with which the invasion would be executed and the ease with which a transition would be made to a stable post-war environment. This is the "they will greet you with flowers as liberators" notion. And that notion, coming from an Iraqi, albeit one who'd been in exile forever, really meshed nicely with what the proponents of the invasion wanted to hear. So they could cite Chalabi as somebody, look, this is what he says, it must be true. Now, what he said, his predictions, his expectations turned out to be utterly, he also was one of the guys claiming to have knowledge of the weapons of mass destruction program. What he said turned out to be utterly, totally, and completely false. And he's, I think, since largely come to be a discredited figure. So what he said at the time mattered, but I think we would be going way too far if, and maybe I'm overstating your point, I think we'd go way too far if we thought that Chalabi somehow snookered the Bush administration into doing something it didn't want to do. Rather, he gave them that much more of a rationale to do what they already wanted to do. So not insignificant, but not central would be my judgment. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, you made a point of talking about how the Clinton administration had kind of laid the groundwork for military intervention and nation building, and then the Bush administration sort of picked up where they left off. And I'm wondering if you think that then this end of the American empire was inevitable no matter who won the election.
You mean if Al Gore had won? Yes. Well, 9/11 would have happened anyway. Afghanistan would have happened anyway. Would Iraq have happened? I'd say, who knows, right? But my guess is that it may not have. And I think I would base that on, I'm not one of these guys, just as I don't think Chalabi can be fingered as the problem, nor do I think that we can finger the neoconservatives as the problem. Having said that, there was an interval, there was a moment between 9/11 and the spring of 2003 when the arguments that the neoconservatives had been making for years now began to be received much more sympathetically in the inner circles of the Bush administration. And so they did have a momentary influence in helping to shape the thinking about how we would solve our problem by spreading democracy, and how the way to begin spreading democracy is to invade Iraq and to topple Saddam Hussein. Would Al Gore have been as susceptible to advice coming from that quarter? I think the answer is no. Doesn't mean that we necessarily would have avoided the war, but it seems to me that the voices that would have been listened to and would have gotten a hearing in a Gore administration would have been different than the voices that were getting a hearing with Bush. That's much as I would speculate. Yes, sir.
I'm not sure that the leadership question is one that you consider to be terribly essential, given that you said that Mr. Bush and the neocons can get us into this mess, but have very little latitude to get us out. I'm Bruce Russell with Montanans for Impeachment, and
So you have strong views here.
And the primary argument upon which we rest is Ratner's argument from the Center for Constitutional Rights that part of the recovery program is the process of reclaiming our Constitution and some of our treaty agreements and some of our statutes, and I'd ask you to comment upon that process of rebuilding.
Well, I think I'm agnostic on impeachment. I'm not agnostic, I'm actually rather passionate on the question of separation of powers and on the fecklessness of the United States Congress, which has for far, far, far too long deferred to the president or to the executive branch generally on matters of national security. They need to act on our behalf in holding the executive branch accountable. And the Congress has not done that. So although I think that this administration has been a disaster in many respects, to me, the preferred antidote would be to get the Congress to live up to its responsibilities, which they have not done so. Is that an okay answer?
Thank you, Professor. My problem I see now is what I'm calling the twilight zone. But to me, it seems like the genesis of this a lot comes from about 25 years ago in the 80 election when things started, and that was to fund the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and to back Iraq. I mean, I think of that image of Rumsfeld shaking Saddam Hussein's hand. And you didn't mention any of those issues then. I'm curious what you have to say on that.
Oh, could have. Concur with you. It's kind of another talk, which you don't want to hear, I think. But it really, I think, gets to one of the points I was trying to make of how absurd are the claims of our national leaders to understand the direction of events. The support for the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan probably on its own terms was a prudent, perhaps even bold, clever gambit. Chased the Soviets out of Afghanistan. Began to move towards endgame in the Cold War. And we were absolutely clueless about exactly what we were letting loose until it came back to bite us. The support for Saddam Hussein in the 1980s by the Reagan administration was not undertaken because Donald Rumsfeld or anybody else fancied that Saddam Hussein was a good guy, that he was our friend. It was undertaken because in the 1980s, Washington was obsessed with the Iranian Revolution and was persuaded that tilting in Saddam's favor in the Iran-Iraq War would be useful in trying to contain, weaken the Iranians. Well, that was stupid. So again, part of my argument is to be a bit more modest in our expectations of our ability to understand the course of events, and more modest in our expectations of what power can achieve. You know, this whole notion of being a global power, which somehow implies that our interests span the globe, that what happens everywhere somehow matters and requires a response. I don't want to sound like I'm an isolationist here, but there are times actually when the best response to a problem is to just leave it alone rather than to think that you can get in there and fix it. So we did, we made enormous errors. We could have added a whole other list of them that together helped to bring about 9/11. Not for a second arguing we did it to ourselves. I'm not for a millisecond arguing that we deserve to be attacked on 9/11, but it's a heck of a lot more complicated story than simply the notion that it came out of the blue. It didn't come out of the blue. It came about as a consequence of decades of interaction between the West and the Islamic world, or more narrowly between the United States and the Islamic world. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to go back to a point you were making before about Congress. I was wondering if you have any, if you can enlighten us in your experience, if it's at all legal that Congress handed over its war-making powers to the president, and if it's not legal, if there's some kind of recourse we have, or if we have a deficient form of government.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know that much about what's legal and what's not. But what we have is, I think, a tradition of deference to the president on matters of national security that came into existence in the aftermath of World War II. It was a product of the Cold War. I think above all else, it came about because of nuclear weapons and the nuclear standoff between ourselves and the Soviet Union. This bred a sense that, oh my gosh, we live in a time of great danger. We need to empower the president to make decisions to do what's necessary to keep us safe. Now, in the context of the strategy of mutual assured destruction, you can, if you want to, build an argument that says that makes sense. But that era is gone. And we ought to restore to a strict constructionist reading of the Constitution, which says that the Congress has the authority and the responsibility to declare war. I don't know why people in Congress don't get that. Yes, sir. I think this is going to be the last one, right? Because it's 9:30 now. I'm only saying that because I'm tired, believe me. It's 11:30 Boston time.
I hope it's a good enough question to end on, but I wanted to address a comment you made towards the end of your lecture, and then you may have just touched on it a couple questions ago. You suggested, in future suggestions, you mentioned that we should treat Islamic fundamentalism in a way that we did the Cold War, and 2 questions ago you said sometimes it's better to leave places alone. Does that mean then that you would suggest possibly isolating countries where Islamic fundamentalism is rife? Or would you maybe advocate a policy where we aggressively engage those nations, the governments, through social economic aid, working to cut out support for Islamic fundamentalism in groups like Al-Qaeda by changing the basic structure of those nations?
Well, first answer is proceed on a case-by-case basis. Second thing is, yes, I would favor isolation in some instances. Third point would be engagement but not aggressive. I mean, again, let's take the Cold War comparison. You know, and I'm not sure that the methods aren't directly applicable. I think we won the Cold War fundamentally because Marxism-Leninism was fundamentally flawed and its failures became evident to the people of the Soviet Union and of the communist world, and they rejected it. You know, the people in solidarity, the dissidents in Czechoslovakia, the dissidents in the Soviet Union said, this ain't working, we've had enough. And the legitimacy of the regimes gradually crumbled. It came from the inside. But we helped from the outside. We helped from the outside by speaking up from time to time on behalf of human rights. We helped on the outside by trying to make available information, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, magazines that were, and other programs that were funded by the CIA, that people began to say, oh, it's terrible. It was wonderful, actually. So it's gentle, it's patient, it's gradual, it nudges people towards modernity, it nudges them towards tolerance, it refuses to accept changing the world on their terms. That's kind of what we did in the Cold War, and I think that at least as a basic model, it might have value in thinking about how to address Islamic radicalism. Thanks very much. I appreciate it.